Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I'm returning to my recent roots. It's going to sound as if I haven't been doing queer feminist work in a while, but I had my final submission of the dissertation in August. So, not that long ago. Um, Time is flowing by, it's flying by right now, but I feel like in the academic world, 2 months is 2 or 3 months is nothing. So, articles, books take at least sometimes 2 years for an article, 3 years. I think it depends. And academic books, I'm sure our guests will give us a timeline, but it could be at least 5, 6 years. The whole process differs for everyone, especially if they're turning it from their dissertation into their book. So, without me going into a whole rabbit hole here, I'm so excited to be joined with Dr. Margaret Galvan, who is assistant professor of visual rhetoric in the Department of English at the University of Florida. Her archivally informed research examines how visual culture operates within social movements and includes a first book called Invisible Archives: Queer and Feminist Visual Culture in the 1980s. We're holding it out for all of you right now who are watching on YouTube or our Patreon members here. But if you're listening, you're going to have to search up her book so you can see the beautiful cover. It's published with University of Minnesota Press. I absolutely love them. So shout out University of Minnesota Press. In 2021 to 2022, she was in residence at the Stanford Humanities Center as the Distinguished Junior External Fellow, researching a second book about, well, I think this is the book we're going to be talking about, right? Or is this a
No,
new book?
I
Okay.
next project, yeah.
Exciting. Okay, so her next project which is about how communities of LGBTQ cartoonists innovated comics through grassroots formats. So, a nice bridge from Invisible Archives to your second book. I see what you're doing there. Okay. So welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, I think right away I'm just so interested in what got you invested in this topic about queer and feminist visual culture? Like, is this something that predates you being at the University of Florida? Like, I'm assuming this comes from your dissertation work, your studies as a PhD student, and then eventually, graduating.
Yeah, no, definitely this definitely goes all the way back to grad school. I in my acknowledgments for writing the acknowledgments for this book, I got like pretty in depth and I was like searching my own like emails and like putting dates on things, but like I think, it goes all the way back to like right before 2010. Um taking courses with Nancy K. Miller, who is an amazing feminist theorist of autobiography, of trauma studies. Um, Also was active. I write about the Barnard Conference on Sexuality, and she was one of the organizers of that conference. So, when I was looking at that period of time, she was like, "Well, do you want to see my copy of the diary?" Which was this um, you know, very what became a very contentious item and was censored during that conference. And so it goes, all the way back to grad school, but certainly something I've been thinking about for a long time. Whether, sometimes you realize something it's sort of been simmering for a while. Like I am in many ways a comics scholar, a scholar of comics, although I talk about other sorts of um, visual production, image text visual production. But when I was little and small, it's hard to find comics by women. You go to comic book shops and they're often very much dominated by the major publishers, dominated by superheroes, which can be really cool, of course, but there aren't a lot of texts by women. And so, when I started to learn about some of this stuff that's been produced in the 80s, but also into the 90s, which is more what I'm looking at in my research now. But some of the stuff continues into that period, a period in which I was like, alive and kicking to not see this stuff or not encounter this stuff, or even something I've been thinking about a lot recently is like the zine, big sort of zine queer core riot girl movements in the 90s. I think I was perhaps a little bit too young for that, but I was making my own little newsletters in Microsoft Word. My dad's a computer programmer, so I'm like learned how to like make really cool newsletters, and they're like they're of a piece with the zines, but I wasn't like connected to this community. And so, it's always been wanting to find that, and then thinking about, how these artists in community built community and welcomed people in, and how they found people, but also how some of this stuff had difficulty circulating or difficulty reaching the next generation. Such that if you talk to, a cartoonist today who's a queer cartoonist, what were they inspired by in the 90s was manga and anime, which was like everywhere and had its own sort of queer thing, and not some of this earlier work because it just was not necessarily readily available to that generation. So that's sort of like, some of the longer tail strands of what gets me to where I am with this book.
Well, I love all of this, and the graphic novel has recently entered my podcast since I had on a queer graphic novelist named Sage Catuno, who just did this like reimagining of Jekyll and Hyde, and it's this whole queer reimagining. I went to Stony Brook and knew Kay Sohini, whose dissertation is on the graphic novel, like her own graphic novel she created, I think. So like Alison Bechdel, I know makes a huge mark, not only in your work, but it seems with someone who you really knew before starting this book. And I remember seeing Fun Home on Broadway. And then like I looked into Alison Bechdel, right? Everyone out there, maybe they've heard of the Bechdel test, um, of like how many women are on screen or in some kind of narrative without men being the topic of their conversation. So, how did Alison Bechdel enter into your life, your work, you know, all of the Alison Bechdel things?
Yeah. No, I there's a chapter in this book about Alison Bechdel. But I've also read a number of other articles about her. So I sort of like, if we, if back in literary scholarship back in the day, there used to be people who were like one author scholars and things like that. If I had to choose just one, it would probably be Alison Bechdel because there's just so much to say about her. Her work is so rich. Um, and I came to sort of thinking about her work through autobiography, through sort of community, through definitely Fun Home was the first thing that I was really engaged with. And then when I was putting together the dissertation, I was really interested, in uncovering and delving and, like talking about people who had got a lot of attention. And my advisor was like, well, but you should do Alison Bechdel. And I'm like, but everyone knows about Alison Bechdel. I mean, there's like, of the comics that have been written about the most, Fun Home is definitely up there um, with Mouse by Art Spiegelman and with Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. Those are like the top three sort of super canonical. But then I took a step back and I thought, well, okay, so she starts cartooning in the 80s. Do we talk about her origins and her origin story? And we don't as much. People do talk about Dykes to Watch Out For, which is her long running series. Starts in 83. She starts doing recurring characters in 86, in 87, sort of like that tipping point. She publishes her first volume of comics with Firebrand out of Ithaca, New York. She ends the comic like in the 2000s, but we don't talk about like where it started. And so, she gets very much valorized as being this, you know, uh, independently genius person, right? And she's totally a genius, but part of it is also she was synthesizing and connecting all the stuff that's happening in the grassroots. And she's like self-syndicating her comic and newspapers across the nation, and like LGBTQ and independent and feminist newspapers. And so they're sending her copies of their newspapers. And so before the internet is really widespread, she's able to see what's happening in different communities and feed all of that into her comic, which is a comic about a community of lesbian women who are friends and lovers, and sort of the larger community that grows from there. But before it was that, it was just individual panels and thematic strips that were published in Women News, which is a feminist newspaper out of New York City, where she was participating just in the collective of the newspaper after moving to New York City after getting like rejected from going to grad school. So if Alison Bechdel went to grad school, completely different story, right? Grad school reject because it's amazing. cartoonist. And so I wanted to tell the story about her and her story about her and community that really hadn't been told, and look at these early comics and look at also how, what the art that she's doing in the newspaper that we wouldn't necessarily consider comics also influences the comics as well. So I have a part where I like look at these little images that she draws of women that are for the letters page, and then it becomes this strip that she does. Um, but even Alison Bechdel, in the 90s, there were articles about her in the Comics Journal where, and I quote this in the book, where the people writing about her are saying, well, she's the best known cartoonist that you've never heard of, right? So she's very visible to queer communities at this time, but she's not visible to straight communities or not visible to younger queer folk like myself who didn't necessarily have access or like direct connections into queer community until later. Like I didn't encounter Dykes to Watch Out For until much later. And so, seeing that early work and seeing how important it was is so formative, right? And to think about, how she's just very much about very much building her work in connection to community. And that's one of the things I'm thinking about. I guess it's throughout all of my work, especially because literary studies has a impulse to canonize or to uplift like an individual author or artist. And so I'm always interested in sort of not displacing that, but thinking about how we are all can be collectively oriented. And being collectively oriented is also like a feminist politic, right? In this moment with her work.
Well, when you went for your PhD program, first, what university did you go to, Margaret?
I went to the grad center at CUNY. So it's
Oh,
a,
okay.
if you've ever been there, it's diagonally across from the Empire State Building. So you got all the tourists outside trying to take a picture, an impossible photo. And then you have this amazing institution that's in an old department store building.
Yeah, it's a very unique campus since I've done a lot of like symposiums, like attending events there. So, yeah, you were in Manhattan at like the center of all of these queer feminist institutions that are there. Like I'm thinking of the Housing Works bookstore is a really cool place. There's also the Leslie Lohman art museum that I'm obsessed with, which is free for everyone out there to know about. It's like the only LGBTQ art museum I really can readily think of. Um, so what was it like for you to like be in that program? I mean, were you in an English program that was adjacent with women's gender sexuality studies? Like, how was that whole experience? Say, do you think it would be different if you were doing a women's gender sexuality studies PhD, and then like how would that maybe have shaped your work differently?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think being at the grad center at CUNY in an English program, absolutely transformative. I always like to say I think of us as a top ranked quirky school. I when I applied, I was wanting to do work in like feminist science fiction, and they're like, okay, well, sure, why not? Um, and just that ability to think non-canonically and to sort of like uh think cutting edge. I mean, even just now, like a lot of the digital humanities stuff coming out, there's a huge group of folks who are doing stuff at the grad center. I won't don't want to say before because I don't want to be like I'm not into like naming things at first, but like doing a whole bunch of stuff and bringing people into think differently. But the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, CLAGS, is a huge force to be reckoned with. So there's just all this amazing LGBTQ energy, amazing activist energy as well. I think for me, those two things intersect. When I was, when I was taking courses, the Occupy Wall Street movement was starting up. So, a lot of folks were, we were in classes and then people were down protesting. And so it's just hard to not have that become part of what you do or to be thinking of, sure, I'm talking about books, but it's important to think about how they circulate in the world and how the world and what's going on in the world, it influences what is in the books, right? And so that is something that was very much, in the atmosphere, and very important to the work that I did. Funnily enough, I did not do a women's and gender studies certificate. I did a film study certificate because I really wanted to hone that sort of visual aptitude in my work, even though I don't actually talk directly about film in this book, but it's definitely that filmic discourse is something that I'm overthinking about how to talk about images deeply. Um, so yeah.
Well, so you being in New York City for your PhD studies, I just find it fascinating because you start us off on this really cliffhanger teaser of a moment with, you've already mentioned it, but there's this whole brouhaha over what's called the Diary of a Conference on Sexuality. And it sounds like you call it this image text, or it has some history to it. I mean, what is this item that you're putting under such scrutiny, Margaret? Just for everyone out there, like, what does the item look like?
Yeah.
With your visual rhetoric hat, how can we
Y-
all imagine what this text is? I hope you enjoyed this portion from the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. To listen to the rest of the episode and watch it, head to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/ Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And just for you all, I'm giving a promo deal for our Patreon. So for 1 week, you get a free trial. Join the ITBR professor level, which is $10 a month. But again, you get a 1 week free trial and you can watch the rest of this episode and also see our full catalog of unedited and ad-free video episodes, exclusive audio episodes, including Married to Pippi's True Crime and Academia series, our Queer as Folk and Smash TV show rewatch podcast episodes. You're going to unlock everything. And also, you'll see that every month we host a book club. So you can also join our book club. Okay, see you all on the Patreon.